All right, let's get right into it. For decades, the big idea for fighting climate change was, well, to put a price on pollution. The thinking was, if we create a global carbon market, that market will find the most efficient way to save the planet. A simple, elegant solution. But the reality? It's been a lot more complicated, full of contradictions, and honestly, often a story of failure. So today, we're going to unpack the messy politics of these markets, from their super optimistic beginnings right up to their current crisis.
So what does that crisis actually look like? Well, it looks like this number right here. In just a single year, the global voluntary carbon offset market had a whopping 61% of its value just wiped out. We're talking about a drop from nearly $2 billion to around $700 million. Now, this wasn't some gentle market correction. No, this was a total collapse in confidence, and it was driven by explosive reports that many of these carbon offset projects were frankly worthless. This really sets up the central tension we're going to explore, the beautiful idea versus the messy and often failing reality.
You know, at the very heart of these carbon markets is a philosophy called neoliberal environmentalism. The basic idea is to reframe climate change. It's not a political problem or a social one. It's a market failure. The argument goes something like this. Pollution is what economists call an externality, a cost that isn't priced into doing business. So, the solution? You just create a new market to price it in. This means literally turning the atmosphere's ability to absorb carbon into a commodity, a new kind of asset that you can buy and sell. It's an extension of what scholars call accumulation by dispossession, where something that was once a common resource for everyone gets fenced off and privatized.
And the most popular way to do this whole thing is through a system called cap and trade. On paper, the theory is really slick. First, a government sets a firm limit, a cap, on total pollution. Then it issues a limited number of permits to pollute. Now here's the clever part. If a company cleans up its act and doesn't need all its permits, it can sell the leftovers to another company that's struggling to cut its own emissions. In theory, this creates this powerful financial incentive to innovate and decarbonize at the lowest possible cost to society. It sounds perfect, right?
And for a while there, this idea absolutely took the world by storm. After the Kyoto Protocol, we saw a global boom in these schemes. The European Union launched its massive ETS in 2005. The UN's Clean Development Mechanism got a huge expansion. And then, boom, regional and national markets started popping up all over the place, from the US East Coast to California, all the way to South Korea. There was this genuine belief that we were building a connected global carbon market that was going to be the key to solving the whole climate crisis.
But the very first big real-world test revealed a massive flaw in the design. Just look at these numbers from the EU's pilot phase. In 2006, the price for a ton of carbon was a pretty respectable €25. But by the end of 2007, the price had plummeted to virtually zero. We're talking 6 cents. So what happened? Well, governments, under a ton of pressure from industry, had given out way too many free permits. The supply just flooded the market, making the allowances worthless and completely removing any reason for companies to pollute less. It was really the first major red flag that the political reality of these markets was going to be tricky.
And this leads us to this fascinating and kind of spooky concept, zombie markets. See, even after the prices crash and the scandals hit, these systems often refuse to die. The EU ETS, for example, saw its turnover just crater, falling from $140 billion in 2008 to $53 billion in 2013. And yet, it survived. These markets are kept alive not by any sound economic logic, but by pure political will and the sheer momentum of the institutions built around them. They just keep shambling on, even when they're not really doing their job.
So that promise of pure market efficiency, it clearly ran into some trouble. But the problems actually run a lot deeper than just volatile prices. In fact, this relentless pursuit of so-called efficiency has created a whole host of hidden social and political costs that we need to talk about. Okay, so here's the catch. When governments give these pollution permits away for free, it doesn't mean pollution is free for you and me. This chart shows you why. Power companies, for example, got their allowances for free, but then they priced the electricity they sold to us as if they had to buy those allowances. They passed on this imaginary opportunity cost, and the result? Higher energy bills for regular households and absolutely massive windfall profits for the polluters, often without them having to cut their emissions one bit. And this inequality doesn't just stop at the national level. Let's look at the UN's Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM. This was the program that was supposed to channel investment from rich countries in the north to green projects in the developing south. A great idea. But look where the money actually went. Over half of all the credits went to projects in China alone. And when you add India to the mix, it's over 70%. This wasn't some diverse global development program. It was a highly concentrated system that benefited just a couple of major industrial players.
And this gets to a core critique of the whole system. What it allowed was for polluters in the global north to meet their climate targets by just buying cheap offsets, essentially paying someone else somewhere else to cut emissions for them. But this often just entrenched the power of industrial elites in the south. And worse, in many cases, it funded projects that were going to happen anyway, which means it generated huge profits with zero real benefit for the climate. Critics have a sharp name for this: sub-imperialism, a system where global inequalities are actually reinforced, not solved.
This quote from scholar Kathleen McAfee just perfectly captures the two sides of this debate. To the supporters of these markets, the fact that it's cheaper to pay for emission cuts in a poorer country, well, that's the whole point. That's market efficiency in action. But to the critics, it's a profound moral failure. It's just outsourcing your responsibility and shifting the real burden of climate action onto the people and places with the least wealth and the least power.
And sometimes that burden is absolutely devastating. Forest-based offset projects, known as REDD+, have been especially controversial. This is where companies pay to protect forests from being cut down. But in practice, these projects have been linked to land grabs, forced evictions, and the criminalization of indigenous communities whose traditional way of life is suddenly seen as a threat to a carbon project. The situation has gotten so bad that the UN's own special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples recently called for permanent moratorium on all carbon markets. All of these issues, the market failures, the windfall profits, the human rights abuses, they all point to a much deeper problem that the whole market mechanism tends to hide: the profound inequality that sits right at the heart of the climate crisis. So let's ask the big question: who is actually responsible?
This chart shows something called the 10-50 relationship, and it is staggering. The top 10% of individual emitters on the entire planet are responsible for nearly half, 45% of all global emissions. Meanwhile, the entire bottom half of the world's population, all of them combined, are responsible for just 13%. It is a brutal reminder that climate change is being driven by a relatively small, high-consuming slice of humanity. But here's where the story gets really interesting. The nature of this inequality has changed over time. Back in the 90s, the main story was the gap between countries, the US versus India. But today, the inequality within countries, the gap between the lifestyles of the rich and the poor inside the US or inside China or inside India, is just as big a part of the story. The problem is no longer just about which country you live in, but about which consumption class you belong to.
And the takeaway from this is crystal clear. If we're serious about tackling climate change, policy can't just be about national targets anymore. It has to be aimed directly at the super carbon-intensive lifestyles of the highest emitters, no matter what passport they hold. The climate fight is increasingly a fight against extreme consumption inequality, period. So this brings us to a pretty radical, but when you think about it, a logical conclusion. If the problem is fundamentally one of inequality, then maybe the solution has to be one of redistribution. And not just redistributing wealth, but redistributing the atmosphere itself. Let's explore what a new framework for this could look like. Here's one proposed path forward. First, the high-income nations, the ones historically responsible for most of the mess, invest heavily in technologies like carbon capture to actually start pulling CO2 out of the sky. They don't just get to net zero, they go net negative. By doing this, they're actively cleansing the atmosphere and creating what you could call carbon space. And this newly available atmospheric room can then be used by low-income nations for their own development without pushing the entire planet over the brink. The big lesson here is incredibly powerful. The failure of our climate policies so far, including these carbon markets, isn't really because inequality exists. It's because we keep demanding the same uniform contributions from profoundly unequal actors. A policy that asks a subsistence farmer in Mozambique to make the same proportional sacrifice as a billionaire in Silicon Valley isn't just unfair, it's completely doomed to fail from the start.
And so, that leaves us with this final crucial question. For years, we've tried to solve the climate crisis by putting a price tag on nature, believing the market would magically calculate the most efficient solution. But after decades of mixed results, failures, and really damaging unintended consequences, maybe it's time to ask if this is even the right tool for the job. Can we really fix the climate with a price tag? Or does true, lasting climate justice demand a completely different kind of calculation altogether?